Greetings, dear listeners. A special episode this week. Shadi and I invited on Robert Malley, one of the most knowledgeable experts on the Middle East, and co-author, with Hussein Agha, of the new book called Tomorrow is Yesterday: Life, Death, and the Pursuit of Peace in Israel-Palestine. Rob's not just some expert. He worked with Clinton, Obama, and Biden. He was there at Camp David. The book is a bracing treasure trove of historical analysis and first-person experience. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Before we get started, a reminder to head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and consider becoming a paying subscriber if you're not one yet. And don't forget to give us a like and review on your favorite podcast app. With all that out of the way, on to the show.
Okay. I'm really excited. I think we're really excited to have Rob Malley on to talk about his new book, but also Israel, Palestine, October 7th, the future of Gaza.
It is
Big
October 7th as we record. Worth noting.
That's exactly. So we're 2 years in, and Rob is an ideal interlocutor for this conversation because, well, first of all, the book is incredible, and I'll say a little bit more about it. For our viewers, they can see the cover here. The title is great. Tomorrow is Yesterday: Life, Death, and the Pursuit of Peace in Israel, Palestine. And we'll include a link in the show notes. You guys should seriously consider buying a copy, getting it from your local library, whatever it takes to read this. You should read it. And
steal this copy, right?
Steal this copy, indeed. I do think it's one of the single best books I've read on Israel, Palestine, period. Right up there with Nathan Thrall's The Only Language They Understand. So I was kind of thinking of his book a little while I was reading yours. It should be noted you are the co-author, so also plaudits to Hussein Agha, who also brings a really fascinating background to this as someone who has advised Palestinian leaders in key negotiations. And Rob, you're kind of, you've done something that very few people have done. You've served at senior levels in 3 different administrations working on the Middle East. And you're actually someone whose views I respect. So that kind of
small group, a rare confluence,
rare confluence. So you were on the negotiating team for Camp David. With President Clinton. You were the White House coordinator for the Middle East under Barack Obama, and it's worth noting that is the senior most position responsible for the Middle East. So you were really in the room at key moments, and then you were special envoy to Iran under President Biden. So you have a lot of scars, a lot of challenging experiences you went through. Maybe just to get us started, I want to talk to you about the title and just get you to expand on it a little bit more. You write early on in the book, I'll quote you here. You say, "For many of the conflict's protagonists, tomorrow does not lie in the future. It is yesterday." Quite poetic, but maybe a little bit hard for everyone to wrap their heads around. Just unpack how the nature of time, history, the future versus the present, and how that kind of figured into your framing of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah, great. First, thanks so much for having me. I love this podcast, and I've learned so much from reading and listening to you. So it's really an honor to be on. So I think the title, which Hussein and I came up with, it sort of was triggered by the reactions to October 7th and Israel's war that followed, where people were talking about it as if, almost as if Hamas were an extraterrestrial organization, and that the events had nothing to do with Palestinian history, and Israel's response was simply the product of right-wing fanatics, had nothing to do with Israel. And I think what we were thinking very strongly is, well, look, let's look at the history. It's far from the first time that Palestinians, in different guises, not Islamists, in fact, way back then, it was sort of the quote unquote secular version of the Palestinian national movement that engaged in similar acts of trying to sort of project onto Israeli territory the fears that they think Israel has projected on theirs, to trying the captives becoming captors, sowing fear that they feel that they felt, and sort of reenacting their own tragedy and trying to inflict as much of it as possible on the Israelis. And this goes back, decades. And on the Israelis, and that's why, by the way, I think it's fair to say, even though it's hard to hear, that most Palestinians reacted with a sense of pride and accomplishment at October 7th. Some of them didn't really know what had happened. They didn't believe what was being told. But I still think even when they knew that, they didn't want to believe it because they also felt this sense of pride. Finally, the Palestinians, which is why we say that October 7th was Palestinian through and through. But likewise on the Israeli side. Nothing new in this notion that the Zionist movement wants to rid the land of Palestinians. Massacres go back from 1948 onwards. And most of Israeli society, vast majority, has applauded the war to the extent that they are unhappy. It's not because they think the war has been too cruel. It's because they don't like Netanyahu, or because they want the hostages out. But the other thing, I was talking just recently to a former senior Israeli official who hadn't read the book and said, you know what, we're back in 1947. And that's something that really, I told him, yeah, and this is what the book says, and maybe even earlier, maybe the turn of the 20th century. That's just Palestinians adrift, rudderless, without a leadership, not knowing where they're going. At best, they could think of survival or individual acts of revenge. We've seen that in the past. Israelis who think that their existence was at stake on October 7th and now want to use their full power to try to rid themselves of this threat, that again, and perhaps engaging in ethnic cleansing. Nothing new. The vocabulary, and I'll end on this, it's really, for those of my generation, but even more Hussein's generation, Holocaust, Nakba, genocide, Zionism is racism, binational state, ethnic cleansing. All of that speaks to us from the past, because that was the language of the past, which has ultimately been brought to the surface now. I said it was the last thing, but part of our theme is that the peace process that both Hussein and I were involved in to try to get a two-state solution ultimately changed nothing. It changed the surface, it changed events. But in terms of the core of the conflict, what the conflict was about, the emotions, the psychology, the history, it didn't affect it because it wasn't speaking to that. And that's why, again, we are back to the past.
Yeah, that's an important point right there. I think you make a convincing case that the two-state solution did not and does not speak to the deepest yearnings of both sides. And you do title one of your chapters, Yearnings. Can you maybe help us understand what those yearnings are in kind of short form for a layperson, just so folks can kind of follow the argument? Because I think in some ways you're saying that October 7th unlocked the kind of primitive core of the conflict. It was always there, but it was obscured by this obsession with the peace process, that the U.S. had kind of forced a process onto unwilling participants in a way that was almost technocratic. It was this idea that if you could only come up with a formula for an exchange of land, that maybe this could all go away and history wouldn't matter as much. And you even admit that you fell under that illusion yourself for some time. This idea that when you're negotiating, don't dwell too much on the past. But now I think you're very much of the view that post-October 7th, maybe you approached it in not quite the right way during your time in government, and now you're seeing it in a different light. So maybe just help us think about that a little bit more.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And again, just to reference those things that you've written about, which is the way in which what some people call sort of liberal peacemaking, Western peacemaking, is often looks down in a patronizing way to people who feel an attachment to history or to religion or to emotions, because those seem irrational, hard to deal with. So you want to deal with the tidy, neat, sort of quick fixes, which is let's just divide the land, say Jerusalem, part of this is to you, part of this to you. Let's forget about refugees, let's forget about history. But you asked about the yearnings. So what is the Zionist movement at its, it's a yearning and an attachment, a Jewish attachment to all of the land, to Eretz Yisrael, and to try to pretend that that's not true and to build a peace process that pretends that, for Israelis, Tel Aviv matters more than Hebron, which is not true for many Israelis. For many Israelis, Hebron is more sacred, has more religious and historical connotation than what is now in Israel proper. So there's all that piece of Jewish desire for recognition, normalcy, and attachment to all of the land, which we can't wish away. And on the Palestinian side, it's that plus the desire to return, the refugees, the refugee rights, which they don't quite understand how it's going to be manifested. But at its inception, the Palestinian movement is a refugee movement. It's not a movement about creating a Palestinian state. In fact, that only comes much later. At its core, and that's why they rejected the partition plan in 1948, why they were not thinking about the 1967 boundaries. For them, this is an attachment which goes beyond sort of a map, but to all of it, and to the desire for justice and redemption of what happened, or a correction of what happened in 1948. And none of that really gets taken into account in the negotiations that I was a part of. And again, I used to say, when I met with people who would say, you need to deal with these issues, my reaction was, let's first end the conflict. Let's have a Palestinian state and a Jewish state of Israel. Then we could deal with those, sort of basically misunderstanding that those issues are the conflict. So how do you resolve a conflict when you ignore the issues that are at the core of the conflict? And I think that's the paradox and the realization that both Hussein and I have come to.
So, I mean, I found the book, again, just, and there's, for people who haven't read, there's, I think, there's an excerpt in the New Yorker, I think was the lengthy excerpt of it there. It gets at what you were saying earlier, I think is really something that jumped out at me basically shortly after October 7th was exactly that. I was focusing more on Hamas at that point. I wrote a piece here for Wisdom of Crowds saying that, if you don't understand Hamas as like the legitimate revolutionary movement of the Palestinian cause at this point, you're missing something. So I was, to see like a much more learned, that's me shooting from the hip basically, but to see like a much more learned and deep discussion of this was, I mean, it's really edifying. But how do I put it? In reading the book, I'm because I come from the Balkans, and because the Balkans are, have a surfeit of history, if you will, and that's how conflicts there are, constantly litigated and relitigated, even if we've had several decades of peace now. It is one of those things. I read your book as a helpful corrective against how do I put it? Utopian thinking, right, about two-state solutionism. But at the same time, there's a challenge of too much history, right? And at least as, trying to compare the Balkan conflicts. I mean, obviously, a peace was imposed at the end of the most recent ones in the 1990s. In Bosnia, quite imperfectly, and it's still not fully functioning. But it is possible to impose peace settlements once, presumably, you get to a certain point in a conflict, right? And partition has worked. It's not inconceivable that it would, right? I mean, is there a problem? While again, I think the book is incredibly edifying and rich and an important corrective of, sort of getting into that pose of admiring the problem very much and admiring all the complexities of it. And, one of the great strengths of Americans I've always found is that, generally their diplomats don't admire problems. And that's part of, where the United States sort of obsession with the two-state solution, I think maybe leads it astray, but it's also that like kind of American approach to these things that maybe informs it. I don't know. React to any part of that.
I mean, there's a lot there, and
Yeah.
very, very on point. First, I'd say shooting from the hip may not be the worst thing, because those who shoot from habit have gotten it wrong. So I do think that a fresh look, that's part of the message of the book, is we need people going to think about this with the new glasses and not simply go back to the habits of the past. So several things. Interesting, I just came back from Sarajevo 2 days ago, and this was much in discussion. Do we have a real peace? Do we not have a real peace? Was it imposed at the expense of sort of desires for justice and for redemption and the real yearnings of all sides. And I would say, my reaction is, hey, if you can get this in Israel-Palestine, sign me up. I would take it, even if it's not perfect. But the problem that we have in the Israeli-Palestinian case, and we say at the beginning of the book, we don't claim that the two-state solution was never possible. We say that it was an uphill battle, a very uphill battle, because neither Israelis nor Palestinians were pushing for it. You don't see them, people killing or dying for two states on either side, right? I mean, that's not where the energy is. It's sort of a, better than nothing. The international community endorses it, but it didn't spring from either side. And what we say is it would have taken an American, sort of what you describe at Dayton, and a lot of people said, why didn't we have this? Even then, I think I'm speaking for Hussein as well, maybe it would have patched things up. I don't think you could have called it sort of end of conflict, end of claims, which is what we were saying as Americans. This is going to end the conflict, and it's going to erase all potential claims. Compare this to the way they dealt with Northern Ireland, and we very briefly mention it in the book, where both sides were told, you know what, yeah, this is maybe a temporary coexistence. You keep your dream of unification. You keep your dream of, being part of the UK. But for now, at least you could live in peace. Here, there was an attempt, which I think was particularly difficult for Palestinians to accept, that if you accept this deal, then everything that you've fought for, basically, it was a mistake. Like, why did the Palestinians fight between 1948 and 1967? They had Gaza on the West Bank. What they didn't have was all the rest. So there's a tension in the book. I think it's fair to say between a feeling that had it been handled differently, maybe the outcome would have been different, at the same time as saying that the odds were really stacked against it because it's not a solution that speaks to what both sides wanted, and especially over time today. And, you still have people saying two states, everything has moved in the opposite direction because nothing has been done to address those feelings, aspirations, and yearnings and fears. So whether it's settlement construction, whether the topography, the politics on Palestinian side where there's no leadership and no vision, on the Israeli side where the right wing and visions of greater Israel are on the ascent. So, maybe there was a time, but when we ask people today who still are saying two-state is the only solution, we say, well, it's been tried under far better circumstances. It failed. Let's at least take a step back and ask ourselves why it failed and not say, oh, simply because, one party didn't do something right. There is something deeper, because otherwise, given how much people tried and I'd say the spectacular peace plans that have been put on the table, they're great. You can't really improve on Clinton, what happened then under President Bush, George W. Bush, and then what happened under Obama. You're not going to do better than that. And yet it failed.
Wait a second. We can't do better than that.
If what you want is a two-state solution, right? A hard partition between two states. Is the territorial division going to be much better than what Kerry put on the table? Are the security arrangements going to be much better than what they put on? But that just it had no resonance with either Israelis or Palestinians. Both sides were saying yes to please the U.S. Neither side really wanted the outcome that was being presented to them. So that's what I mean. I don't mean there's not a better peace, but I'm saying for those, President Macron and others are saying two states. I challenge them, and if they could convince me, I'm all ears. I'd be the first to sign on. Are they going to come up with something better or a process that is better?
But the reason it didn't happen wasn't so much that the terms weren't pretty good, at least in some iterations. It was more that the U.S. wasn't willing to put sufficient pressure on Israel. I mean, that's one interpretation, that at the end of the day, Israelis dominated the peace process. They kind of were able to impose their will. Palestinians were on the receiving end, and it was dictated by one side much more than another because of the inherent power imbalance. If only we had a United States that was able and willing to push Israel on even on things that are maybe less technical, like respecting the right of return in some symbolic fashion, or addressing some of those key points. The Israelis weren't willing to address some of those historical issues that were really important to the Palestinians. If only they were.
Yeah, and so again, I struggle with that question. It's kind of hard to think about that counterfactual of the U.S. that would actually do what you just said, which is basically to tell the Israelis you're going to have to give up parts of your narrative and then also convince the Palestinians that they're going to have to give up parts of there and really put foot on the ground. And we could talk about why for domestic reasons and cultural reasons and understanding reasons, just how the American, even though we argue in the book that the U.S., that the narratives of both sides were not really addressed by the peace process, clearly the U.S. had more affinity and understanding of the Israeli narrative than of the Palestinian narrative. And I'll just take as one example, when we hear former President Clinton to this day, I think just the other day, say again, I offered the Palestinians a state on X percent, the most generous, and if they rejected that, then how could they complain? That whole framing of offering the Palestinians land as if, from their perspective, it's their land. It's not being given, it's given back, and it's not generous because it's their due. If anything, it's the opposite of generous because they believe that it's only giving them 22% of the land. So no doubt you're right that the U.S. has played I think a pernicious role, and it's interesting to think where we would be if the U.S. had never gotten involved in this. But I don't think it's right to say it's only a matter of that. And it's the reason the U.S. would have had to be so forceful in a way that is hard to imagine, if not impossible to imagine, is because it was very difficult for either side to accept a compromise that would resemble the kind of compromise that was discussed, again, plus or minus over the years. So you're sort of postulating a very different universe where the U.S. has cultural understanding, historical understanding, a willingness to exert pressure equally on both. And as we say in the book, we could say, what if this? What if Rabin had not been killed? What if the Clinton had been more forceful? What if Obama didn't simply believe in the power of his rhetoric, but also the power of his actions? All of that is right. But at some point, don't you have to say, you know what? Those ideal conditions didn't exist, and they didn't exist for a reason. And it's not simply because, only the U.S. had been a little bit more forceful.
Yeah, that makes sense. But it seems in the book that you're sort of taking the U.S. as it is and accepting that as an unfortunate fact of life and saying, because of X, Y, and Z constraints, the U.S. will never be the way we want it to be. It will never be more balanced. It will never be more fair. It will never be more understanding of Palestinian aspirations. A different course, especially looking forward, is to say, well, what if this hypothetical better U.S. can actually be brought into existence because of changing public opinion, where more and more Americans are sympathizing with the Palestinian side, where the Democratic Party, more and more, I would say congresspeople, senators, still not a majority, but a growing number are calling for a suspension of weapon sales to Israel, for example, if they don't stop the genocide, so on and so forth. That maybe the hope for the pro-Palestine side is not simply to say the U.S. is the way it is, we have to accept it, but to say, let's actually fight for a different kind of America that has different policies and a different vision in this conflict.
So
what would you say to
absolutely,
that?
and I think we allude to it at the end. I think part of the cost of having been at this for so long part of the benefit is that I have some knowledge. Part of the problem is I may become too cynical, but it is true that there's a sea change in American political and public attitudes. I teach on campus. I see it on the students. This Gaza war is going to mark them in terms of their own vision of America's role in American foreign policy in the same way that Vietnam may have marked one generation and the Iraq War another. So I do think you're absolutely right. Again, is that going to be enough, given where we are, to change the fact that deep down, Israelis and Palestinians are not particularly happy with the what's on offer, what will be on offer? So, tell me which American president is going to find a way to dislodge hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers, or to convince the Palestinians that they have to give up on the right of return, or the Israelis that they have to acquiesce to something. So again, reaction to the book is somebody saying, well, you've given up, you're taking the world as it is. We hope our message is for people to say, like you just say, well, things could change, and let's think of what it looks like, but not just a different U.S. behavior, but a different apprehension of the conflict, what's at stake for the parties, and a different solution. And maybe people will call it a two-state solution. We have ideas about loose confederation. We don't have a blueprint. It would be both preposterous and completely disconnected from where we are today. But there are other ideas, confederation, where settlers could have the citizenship of Israel but live anywhere. Refugees have the citizenship of the Palestine but can live anywhere. Maybe those are the kind of ideas which have been taboo. Nobody's spoken about them in officialdom. People are beginning to talk about or have spoken about. In fact, as we make in the point, these ideas have been there for generations. It's just that there's been this sort of straitjacket of how you think about hard partition along ethnic state lines. And that's the one that we just don't see that as happening. And I've not heard anyone other than this change that you're pointing out, which I think could be a very interesting one. I don't think that would be enough to get us to where people thought we would be.
No, and I mean, I think the power of the book is, and I think in while I think properly fingering the responsibility on a lot of this, for failures of American imagination and mediation, but also just pointing out to, again, what I was alluding to earlier, like the fact of, again, to import a Balkanism, ancient ethnic hatreds, right? And the reality is that you often just don't have partners to be able to do this. And I think, Shadi, I mean, just listening to you there, but I think the power of the book is that I think it's pretty even-handed in not saying that there is a reasonable solution to this, that it's not that if only the Israelis were brought to heel, the Palestinians would take half the pie either. So, I mean, I think that's an important message to take away from this book, is that the conflict itself is much more of a problem than America's support for Israel, I would say. So, I mean, but before we even get to that, I mean, I just sort of preface that. You can jump in, Shadi, as soon as I'm done with that a little bit. But the the question I have, I guess, and that you can react to this one also, Shadi, is the extent to which, how many examples can we think of, quite frankly, unequal conflicts that end up in a solution that is seen as just by both sides? And that's one of those, again, things that always kicks around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which I find fascinating in a way, not being an expert in it, but it's that the question of justice looms over it in ways that I think most other conflicts in the world just doesn't. And the question of justice captures the imagination of mediators, observers, everyone, in ways just like others just don't. Equally, if not more horrific conflicts elsewhere around the world. So, I mean, I don't know, Rob, just reflect on that, but I know Shadi's going to jump in
and
here.
then send it over to Rob with my mediation, because I think this is really, I think we're getting at something which is a little bit delicate to discuss, which is, I do think there is something. What? Sorry?
I said, let's do it.
Yeah.
Can't wait.
Look, there is something, I think, somewhat unusual about the Palestinian spirit. You'd think that it would have been destroyed by now. And in other conflicts where you see such brutality against a kind of an occupied force or a kind of destitute people, those people oftentimes give up or accept defeat in the face of overwhelming power and strength. That has not been the case with Palestinians. Now, I think this is often a complaint that people make about Palestinians, where people will be like, okay, why can't they just accept defeat? Why are they obsessed with these historical claims? Why do they want so much more than territory? Why do they, at the end of the day, this is what I think your book captures, and it becomes hard. I can see how it can be used against Palestinians to say that they are not rational. They are not normal. They are different than other peoples.
But no people are rational or normal is actually the bigger lesson of history. And all these conflicts.
But Damir, you're sort of saying that some do accept defeat in the face
some
of
are
overwhelming
defeated
power.
more than others. And I mean, I think there's less mediation that goes into them. I mean, again, we've done this before, Shadi. I think comparative slaughter is not a very tasteful thing to engage in.
No, but I think there is. But Palestinians do take pride in their unwillingness to just bow down to the kind of reality of force. I think that is something that every
conflict that's been mediated internationally since almost the beginning in a way that many others haven't.
And for which there is so much broad international support for the Palestinian cause, which they've not been able to translate into power on the ground. But,
that's right.
It does give them the sense that they have. But, I want to get back to what Damir said, because for me, it's very important. Elliot Abrams, who I know well, we don't see eye to eye. But he wrote an article in which he said, you know what? Yeah, the stuff I don't like, but just the point you made, he used it against the Palestinians to say, you see, they never really were interested in the two-state solution, and he quotes at length from the piece. Now, I could take that as one-sided, but I also took it as, yes, that's what our book was trying to do, which is to say there is an Israeli narrative, and yeah, we may not, Palestinians don't like it, and Hussein has worked as an advisor to the Palestinians. On the American spectrum, would be considered to be obviously more sympathetic to the Palestinians than some of my colleagues on the peace team. But I think both of us have tried as much as we could to try to look at the world also through Israeli eyes. We say in the book that Hussein has always found himself more at ease talking to Israeli right-wing officials and thinkers, because he felt, yeah, they get it. They get it that they are honest about their yearnings, and they understand that the Palestinians also are not there simply to say, well, let's divide the land between both. And, the truth is, from an Israeli perspective, they would say, Palestinians rejected partition in 1948. They tried to destroy us. They time and again rejected a two-state solution. They were defeated. And now we're prepared to give them something. And whenever we give them something, Oslo leads to more terror. The Camp David, when it fails in 2000, you have the Intifada. We withdraw from Lebanon, we get Hezbollah. We withdraw rockets. We withdraw from Gaza, we get Hamas rockets. There's a counter-narrative to all of that I'm not only familiar with, but that I think is largely correct. But those are elements that we can't simply say, oh, it's a matter of just more pressure that America needs to put on Israel, because it bumps up against very profound feelings on the Israeli side where they think, yeah, we're being singled out. Again, I think both sides are singled out. I could go on and on, but I think the Israelis feel like, as we say sometime in the book, okay, we are attacked and we're asked to show the restraint that our opponents like Iran doesn't. Palestinians attack us. The answer to the attack is you need a Palestinian state. They engage in more violence. The answer is a Palestinian state. They reject a Palestinian state. The answer is a Palestinian state. So I get that. And I think that's how I say some Israelis on the right have said that they found this book easier to read than what they hear from Israelis on the left, because they felt that it's what we really tried to do, not to be dismissive of the feelings and the attitudes of those on the Israeli side who think, yeah, all of this is just bias.
But at the end of the day, and Damir won't like me saying this, he doesn't like the word moral, but I'll just use it here. But at the end of the day, though, I think we have to say that the two narratives are not morally equivalent. I get the idea of writing in a book and trying to convey to the best of your ability the Israeli perspective, because we have to understand where Israelis are coming from. But at the end of the day, I worry about treating them as two kind of co-equal narratives, where we go from one side to the other, and we do understanding one, then understanding the other. And I mean,
But again, just you didn't, Shadi, react to what I was saying earlier, though. Is just, again, why is this conflict the one that must be adjudicated justly, as opposed to more reflective of realities on the ground?
Anything less.
No, but that's the thing. I mean, maybe
they haven't.
Again, it's been the most heavily mediated conflict, I think, even outside the United States. Again, is the sort of question. I know. I mean, the fact is, it's also not going to become a less mediated conflict, right? I mean, that's the other part of it. Is that again, the power of the book, and this is, again, we're getting back to the beginning part of it, which is that it is such a comprehensively good embrace of the intractability and the depth of the conflict on so many levels, including the mediation, I think, which makes it such a powerful book. But, again, I don't know. I think as a result, these questions of justice and morality end up like running up short, Shadi. Like they go against the sort of the main power of the book in a lot of ways. I don't know, Rob, what do you think about that?
But we also don't want to fall back into ancient hatreds, something like the ancient hatreds
and
thesis,
I don't think
which you
so.
Sort of,
yeah,
which you did mention, Damir. You used that phrase, and I just.
Yeah.
I think we have to be very careful about that. I mean,
Yeah, so I want to agree and disagree with Damir on this,
Yeah.
on something. So on the disagreement, I think, some people have written, yeah, this is sort of resonant with when Clinton said, you have ancient hatreds in the Balkans, to come back to that, and
Yeah.
Jews, and it's not our view. We don't think this is a conflict between Jews and Muslims or Jews
Sure.
and Christians. Our point is, if we are here today, after all these years of attempts at peacemaking, it means that nothing has been done to address those hatreds, those fears, those aspirations. It doesn't mean that it's eternal. It doesn't mean that you can't find a way to reconcile them, but we've been sort of barking up the wrong tree in
Yeah.
trying to do that. But on the question of morality, listen, I've been accused of being too pro-Palestinian. I'm sure that people would say that about Hussein. But I would ask you, okay, let's assume, the Palestinians have the stronger moral case. Where do you bank that? I mean, and then what? I'm not sure. So, Khalid al-Gindi wrote a review of the book, I think, in Foreign Policy yesterday or today, where he says, sort of echoing what you just said, there's no equivalence between the two narratives. One narrative is more correct and just than the other. Okay, I mean, that's fine. And then, what do you do with that? Like, I'm not sure what is the what's the implication of that? You could read the book and people could conclude whether we think one is more just than the other.
So then Shadi says America wakes up with the generational shift, goes in and imposes a peace that Israel finds unjust. That's basically it. And now to be determined what that would be, but presumably one that favors the Palestinian side at the expense of the Israeli side. That's the answer, right, Shadi?
I wouldn't. Okay, that's maybe an oversimplified version of what I would have said, but maybe some of that I think rings true to me. Yes. I mean, ultimately, moral questions and moral struggles inspire people. And they inspire, ultimately, you would think, if enough Americans change their views on this, that will filter up into policymaking, maybe not exactly, but at least to some extent. And then this would be an argument for pro-Palestine advocates and activists, that the morality question for them is really important because they're trying to persuade and their fellow Americans, but also policymakers, and they're thinking about that generational shift. So that's, I think that's an important part of this.
A comment and then a question to you on this. First of all, I don't know how you convince somebody that their yearnings are wrong. I mean, I was just talking to Hussein, and he was saying, it's like trying to convince somebody that they're not in love with what they're in love with, right? I mean, they feel those yearnings, and we could try to say, well, those yearnings are wrong, and you don't have the right to all of the land, but that's not going to persuade them. You might force it, but again, I'm pretty skeptical about how you could force people to live under an arrangement that they fundamentally disagree with. It may be they coexist for some time, and then the roots of the violence may reappear. But I'm sort of not puzzled, but I want to push back on. You've written a lot about religion and the need to understand perspectives of people who may not be secular and quote unquote rational and logical. I don't know where justice or morality comes in. It's just how people feel, and to tell them, your narrative is morally wrong or morally inferior may be true. As you say, you put a gun to my head. Do I think that the Palestinians have that their cause is just? Yeah, maybe. Although I don't believe that they could. I certainly don't believe that they could eradicate Israel. But, again, what I've learned from you is sort of respect for people's views, even if those views are not the views that you and I or others would necessarily endorse. So I'm just curious how you reconcile that.
It's a good question. And I do appreciate you putting this back on me, that because you're right, I have argued that. I mean, I think that in some ways, Israel-Palestine has tested my ability and my willingness to understand the other side. I still think it's important. But the fact now that genocide, in my view, is part of the new Israeli reality, the fact that a large number of Israelis, perhaps a majority, actually not, a large majority support this war, which means that they support what I consider to be genocidal acts. I mean, at that point, you start to wonder, well, do we draw a line here? Do we say that there's a limit to understanding when one side is committing genocide against an entire people? That's what's been so challenging for me.
So I'm not going to, I like to put myself in other people's shoes. That's sort of a professional habit I have. It's very hard for me to put myself in the shoes of people who are defending what Israel is doing. So if you're talking about the war that we're seeing now, I I actually don't get it. It's very hard for me to understand how people here, maybe some in Israel, but even there, look at this and say, yeah, this is justified because Hamas is, taking refuge among the civilian population, or any, as we've seen some people say, any Palestinian is a terrorist, a potential terrorist, and therefore, so those shoes I can't wear. But I thought we were talking about something different, which is more each side's perspective on the roots of the conflict and what a resolution should do to their feelings, which is different from, is different
this
from
war
what you're
has
addressing.
radicalized everything, and even thinking about like next steps. I mean, I'd like to nudge us towards like where this is all heading, specifically on this, because look, here's a challenge to both of you, right? Okay, so we're recording. It's October 7th, 25. Negotiations are ongoing in Egypt. I haven't seen the latest news today, whether there's been any dribs and drabs coming out of it. Maybe by the time we drop this, we'll have more news. But the bigger question being, of course, that, I mean, over all of this, incessant back and forth, Trump stuck in a nod to a potential Palestinian state at the end of whatever process this is. This is not a peace process like any we've had in the past. It's not mediation at this point. What I was alluding to earlier about, an unequal peace being imposed, these are capitulation terms for Hamas, and they know it. I find it a little bewildering, quite frankly, when commentators say, "Oh my God, but these are capitulation terms." Well, yes, that's exactly what they are. It's not. We shouldn't pretend that they're anything else. And so, I wonder, what do you make? Do you think, I guess are we entering some kind of different phase? And maybe the like maybe follow on, or maybe a precursor to that question was about the Abraham Accords, that again, under the first Trump term, which tried to again take this entire question off the table, and was, again, as Shadi often brings up, by illegitimate autocratic governments across the Arab world, embraced, not fully, but there was appetite for it. And clearly there's some appetite for this capitulation of Hamas and support, though again it's very qualified from reading behind the scenes among Arab partners, but still there's an appetite to again put this aside, this horrible mess, all of this nightmare, this killing, these massacres, just put it aside and then work on other things. That's my feeling, that we're heading, if for some reason this capitulation of Hamas is able to be achieved, forced down on them, we're headed towards another period of like Abraham Accords like stuff. And the sidelining of the whole question that's the core of your book, whether the two-state solution is or isn't. Is that a right read of where we're at right now? I don't know. Am I missing parts of it? Like, what do you think?
So first, I'd say, just as an echo to the title of the book, it is kind of, I don't know if it's ironic. It's sort of a testament to the point we're making, that we're talking about at least in the plan, a trusteeship that will be led by a Brit, basically Tony Blair, without consultation with the Palestinian population. I think that is.
Right.
If that's not déjà vu, I don't know what is.
Right.
But on your point, listen, again, so one other sort of footnote to what you said, which is, to hear the Biden administration officials saying we didn't have leverage, we tried as hard as we wanted to impose something, and then you have President Trump, who is a very different kind of president, who does seem able to put pressure on Israel. That's for another conversation, but I think it does make us think again even more critically of the Biden administration. I think in some ways what we're seeing now is a microcosm of the case we're making. I think you could imagine, with greater U.S. pressure, and both sides have some interest in reaching what I would call sort of the first stage, prisoner hostage deal, influx of humanitarian assistance, some Israeli withdrawal, some diminution at least of the intensity of violence. All the rest, Hamas decommissioning of weapons, this international stabilization force, this board of peace, this, as you say, very, very, very abstract nod, amorphous nod to a Palestinian state. I don't think we'll ever get there. And frankly, at this point, my priority would be, let's just at least end the killing. I think we might get there. It's a terrible deal, and not because it's a Palestinian surrender, as you say. They lost in that sense, so it's going to be hard for them to get anything that is not a surrender. But because it has so many loopholes that it can give an opportunity and a pretext justification for Netanyahu, for the Israeli government to say, well, Hamas hasn't done X, and so now we're back at war. And that's very problematic. But if the president stays focused and he says, at a minimum, I just don't want to see the carnage we've seen, I'll take it. It's very unjust. It's, all the reasons the Palestinians would give. It smacks and reeks of neocolonialism, but I'm not sure that we're going to get much better at this stage.
So it's interesting that Damir used the phrase Hamas capitulation, but you used the phrase Palestinian surrender. And I want to unpack the implications of that divide for a moment, because you do make a number of, I think, controversial claims, at least controversial to Palestinians or the supporters of Palestinians. You mentioned this briefly earlier, that you argue in the book that October 7th was Palestinian to the core. That's a quote. And that singling out Hamas for October 7th would be a mistake. You write, quote, "It was neither uniquely Hamas nor distinctly Islamist," end quote. I think that would probably make a lot of people nervous, because one of the claims of pro-Israel folks, and since day one, I mean, since this war started, is that there is no effective distinction between Hamas and the broader Palestinian struggle, that they are intertwined deeply and in rather complex ways, and that Hamas, in some sense, is taking on the mantle of the Palestinian struggle for liberation. So help us think through that a little bit.
I mean, I agree with that, as you know,
Wait.
from like 2 years ago,
But
Shadi.
can I
I wrote that essay. We
forgot-
argued this point. You disagreed back then. What do you think, Shadi, rather before you ask Rob? Is that correct? Have you changed your thinking?
I mean, well,
I
first of
think
all,
it's-
I've never totally agreed that Hamas equals the Palestinian struggle.
I don't think that's what either. It's not exactly what I said. It's not what Rob's saying either. But
No, I know it's not what Rob is saying, but I think that there is a risk when we talk about October 7th as being representative
Sure.
of a broader swath of Palestinians, that it wasn't about Hamas. It was about a deeper set of yearnings, let's say, that
Right.
Palestinians had. It spoke to their yearnings. It spoke
Correct.
to this sense of this, even a desire for revenge.
And you don't.
Do you disagree with that?
Okay, well,
James?
I suppose but I guess the question that I'm posing to Rob is how that can be used
Sure.
to solidify a certain narrative that has been used to justify the killing of innocents.
Yeah.
That's not what you're doing, Rob. I'm just saying
No,
that
no, I get
it
the
can be
question.
weaponized in a certain way.
So first I want to address the other question that Damir asked me, which I didn't get to, with the Abraham Accords, just very briefly. I mean, and I think it is an issue that has come up in this Trump peace plan. I think Arab countries, and particularly those that signed up to the Abraham Accords and those who are still waiting to do it, like Saudi Arabia, have immense leverage. I think they have been quite derelict in using it. I mean, the fact that the UAE has said that they would question the Abraham, their normalization with Israel, if Israel annexed territory or maybe change the status quo on the holy sites. But what an increasing number of organizations are calling genocide, that's not the red line. That sounds a little bit odd. And I think that they could and should have pressed harder to get this plan to be one that is more realistic and, more able to, with more guarantees.
They want to
That's point
destroy
number one.
Hamas maybe just as much as
I'm
the
not
Israelis
sure that
do,
that's
though.
the case of the Qataris. I'm not sure.
Not the Qataris, but the
UAE.
UAE. I mean, the
But the
UAE and
Qataris-
the Saudis.
Okay, maybe. Fair enough. But this is not about us only defeating Hamas. But the other point, I'm not, and this was, again, maybe controversial among pro-Palestinian crowd, I'm not against the Abraham Accords. I mean, I found, as we say in the book, it's kind of ironic that the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, has denounced the Abraham Accords when they're not only have recognized Israel, they're collaborating on the ground on security arrangements the PA is doing. So then they turn around and they tell the Arabs, you can't do what we're doing, and we're the ones who are under occupation. It's kind of weird. I wish that as part of the Abraham Accords, they'd pushed harder for steps to address the Palestinian question. That's my criticism. But, otherwise to say the Arab countries are the ones who have to hold back on normalization, it's hard for Palestinians, particularly this Palestinian leadership, to give those lessons to the UAE or others. On the question of the danger, and I do think, as I said, Elliot Abrams' piece is an instrumentalization of the book to say, you see, the Palestinians never wanted a two-state solution. It's what we've always been saying. I think we were well aware of the fact that by saying October 7th is Palestinian through and through. People are going to say, aha, therefore all Palestinians are guilty. It's a risk that we decided to take, that we're going to try to call it as we saw it, equally when we say that what people are calling, most experts are now calling, or many experts, a genocide, that also is reflective of Israeli feelings. That's probably not going to be something that many here and elsewhere are going to want to hear. But I don't know how else to interpret both the history of the Palestinian movement, the reaction of Palestinians to October 7th, when, do they feel, when they criticize October 7th, their criticism, as I hear it, is Hamas never thought of the depth of Israel's response and how they protect us. That's their answer. It's not so much, it's amoral, some say that. But most of the criticism, including by the Palestinian leadership, is to say, they took this risk, and now we're confronted with this genocide. Yeah, if you're saying that it was politically stupid, strategically stupid, but was it morally wrong? You don't hear that so much from Palestinians.
But you do hear people saying that we don't believe that Hamas did the things they're accused of. Now, that's a little bit of a...
I said that
it's
earlier.
hard to...
I think that, right. I think there is also that. They deny it, and then, because they don't want to, it's sort of cognitive dissonance. They don't want to think that that's the kind of behavior that they would salute. But, I think they convince themselves. And do they convince themselves, but they know better, or they convince themselves because they don't want to hear the other side? I don't know. But again, as we say, think of the history of Palestinian attacks against Israel. The difference with October 7th is that it, quote unquote, succeeded. I think it succeeded beyond Hamas's own expectations from everything we're seeing in terms of how Israel is simply asleep.
Yeah.
But that desire to make Israelis get a taste of their own medicine, I think that's how, to use that expression, I think that's pretty widespread.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Hamas, I did want to shift gears a little bit to try to get a better understanding of the Hamas leadership and how they think about the aftermath of October 7th, because I should have, perhaps mentioned this earlier, but what also makes you unique, Rob, is that you're one of the few former senior U.S. officials who's actually engaged in dialogue pre-October 7th, we should note, with Hamas leaders and officials, and gotten to know some of them on a more personal level. So very few people will have more insight into their strategic thinking than you do at this moment. So maybe say a little bit more about the Hamas mindset, what really drives them. Obviously, the whole debate about rational versus irrational is somewhat, silly. People are a mix of rationality and irrationality. We all contain multitudes. But what ultimately drives them? How pragmatic are they, or how pragmatic were they?
Yeah, so first, two caveats. A bit awkward for me to talk to you about an Islamist movement, given your knowledge and everything that you've written about it, but I'll give it a try. And secondly, I'm well aware of the fact, and part of when I met with them, when I met with leaders of Hezbollah, when I met with leaders of the Houthis, or anyone I meet with, it was as my capacity as worked for the International Crisis Group, and that's our motto: talk to all sides. It got me in trouble when I then moved on to advise then Senator Obama in his campaign. But that was the role that I was playing, which is try to get a sense, to better understand what they're saying, knowing full well that they were speaking to me, knowing who I was, and that, a Western audience, you're going to try to say things that a Western interlocutor is going to accept. And so they would lean more on their acceptance of 67 than they do internally. They would lean more on a whole host of things that I knew in their own discourse. It's a different language. That said, and we talk about it in the book, our assessment, from my talking to Hamas, from Hussein's dealing with them, is that long-term, yes, their view is a destruction of the state of Israel. It's not, two states. That's not their long-term view. But I hate the word pragmatic, but they have that feel. They know they're not about to destroy Israel. And so they have this sense, and they've said this, Sheikh Yassin would say it in the 90s, let's reach a long-term truce with Israel, based on 67. Of course, they put other elements which made it much less appealing to Israelis, including having to do with the refugees. And then we'll let the next generation, or the generation after that, figure out whether we're going to coexist or whether they're going to go through another round of violence. Again, I don't want to make too much of it, other than to say, if you're looking at counterfactual, what would have happened if instead of after Hamas won the elections, and again, something that you'll be in 2006, something that you'll be very familiar with from other examples. I studied the case of Algeria, but if instead of deciding they're going to be boycotted. We're going to impose these conditions that really demand an ideological conversion, not a pragmatic arrangement. That there's going to be a blockade on Gaza. If instead of that, we'd said, okay, we're going to engage, but here, and try to do it in a way that leads them to move slowly, not engage in acts of violence. They don't have to give up on their ideals. Or even, as recently as 2021, when there was talk of an election on the Palestinian side, and there haven't been elections since 2007, so the legitimacy of those in power today is, at the very least, questionable. What would have happened if instead of the Biden administration saying, you know what, we're afraid Hamas is going to win, so we're going to help those in Israel and on the Palestinian side who were against elections? What would have happened if those elections had taken place? Hamas, I don't think they would have won the way they won in 2006, but they might have done well enough that then you agree to some kind of coalition, and they get involved in politics. It was clear that they knew that governing Gaza had become a burden rather than an opportunity because they couldn't govern under conditions of siege. So, what if that had happened? Would
And
October 7th have
7th
happened?
probably wouldn't have happened, yeah.
I mean, I don't know, but certainly we know that the way Israel and the international community dealt with Hamas led to the outcome. And so when I hear people saying, Israelis in particular, but also Americans, you see, this proves that we were right to deal with Hamas as somebody who we can't frequent. I'd say it proves, if anything, it proves the opposite. I'm not sure it proves anything, but it should at least make us think again about how do you deal with movements like Hamas, like other Islamist movements, whose views, long-term views in particular, we don't endorse, but have popular legitimacy. And maybe you could steer in the direction of governance and, part of the political spectrum rather than holding them at arm's length, imposing conditions, sanctioning, boycotting, and pretending that they're not who they are. And I mean, that they don't have the legitimacy they have. And, back in terms of Gaza, sort of supporting attempts to undo the results of the elections. And I was, by the way, I was an election observer. I say this in the book. What I don't say is right after the election, when Hamas had won, I went to see President Abbas and people around him. My message was, I've seen this before in Algeria when the Islamic Salvation Front was about, everyone knew they were going to win the elections, the army intervened, counseled, and you had a brutal civil war. And I said, is that really what you want to see? President Abbas, turns out he then was persuaded otherwise. He said, I completely agree. We need to reach some kind of compromise with Hamas. Everyone around him was telling me we're not going to let them govern. They can't hijack our national movement. We're going to get rid of it. And again, that's, I think everything we've seen is at least in part a result of that.
But just to underline that, though, again, it's not a controversial point then that of course this, there was this not even all that tacit understanding among the Israelis and among Netanyahu himself that having Hamas entrenched in Gaza, by dividing the Palestinian cause that way was useful. And part of again, he was allowing aid to flow in. The fact that Israel was asleep on October 7th has a lot to do with the fact that Netanyahu himself was quite complacent about, Hamas being entrenched in Gaza, being containable and quite frankly, good for Israel to have that all in place. I mean, it's one of those things that I imagine once this is all over, the sort of figuring out the decision-making process and inside Israel, how that, all came about and how that blind spot emerged is a pretty profound one. But just to, on that, the question is, though, just if I'm understanding, once the Civil War happened, it would have been pretty hard to, do a co-governance thing. So after 2007, when there were many, you think you could have brought them back together?
That. There were many efforts after that to try to get them together. The Saudis were mediating, others were mediating. I think at the end of the day, President Abbas didn't really want it, and many people in the West, in the U.S. in particular, had no appetite for any kind of reconciliation. But I want to not necessarily push back, but nuance what you said about the Israeli approach. It is, I think, their approach was, let's give them just enough to survive, but not enough to really be able to govern, which turns out to be the worst of both worlds. But this criticism, and I don't want to sound like I'm defending Netanyahu, but the criticism, he's the one who allowed the assistance to go in. Well, what do they want people to do? To starve Gaza completely and hope that would have led to a better outcome? So the real problem with the blockade and with the sanctions, which I've seen time and time again, is it did not weaken Hamas because they're the ones who control all the distribution channels and it sort of strengthens them, it weakens any other Palestinian, and it gives them, they're in the situation where at some point they felt, you know what, we keep being told that the siege is going to be loosened at the end of all of our confrontation, and Israel does a little bit, then one step forward, two steps back. At some point they decided, you know, let's just roll the dice and see, and try for something more dramatic. So again, I don't think the lesson from this was, oh, Israel should have starved Hamas of resources. I don't see that as which is some people in Israel are saying, you know, never let Qatar get the funds. The better option would have been, you know, open the siege. That's the option, not to give money to Hamas. So again, that's the nuance I'd introduce.
As we wrap up here, Rob, I just wanted to ask a couple things about your experience in government and how that sort of has shaped your thinking. More specifically, I'm curious about Barack Obama, that period in particular. You don't talk a whole lot about it, but you do mention a couple different points that there was a lot of expectation around Obama among Palestinians. People really believed that he would break the mold, and he is the one who, based on his own history in Chicago with people like Rashid Khalidi and even Edward Said, he knew the Arab community there, and he was much more predisposed to the Palestinian narrative than probably any president has been, perhaps even by far. So there is a tragedy here about Barack Obama, and you sort of allude to the fact that he, at some point, he was so disillusioned that he kind of just gave up on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Although towards the end of his second term, there was some kind of nostalgic kind of going back and trying to learn lessons, and he had some regrets about what he did or didn't do. But Obama still feels to me as a kind of enigma, and it's been somewhat surprising, although not really surprising, that he's been very reluctant to take a strong stand on the Gaza war. Despite, I can only imagine what he feels more deeply in his heart. It's always, I think, maybe a fool's errand to kind of get into this question of what politicians really believe. But I can't help but think that Obama really believes something different than what he says in public. You knew him, you know him. Help us understand a little bit, like the enigma of Barack Obama, if you can.
So first, I mean, I've known him from law school, and I have huge admiration for his intellect and for some of his instincts, and the fact that he did come from a background where I think it made him more capable of understanding not just the U.S., but how the U.S. is perceived by others. And I think that's what drew me to him. I also want to add that, again, you and I have discussed this for your own book, and you've opened my eyes not just to some of the contradictions, paradoxes, failures of the Obama administration, but also some things that I participated in, you know, war against terrorism, et cetera. So those are the two things I'd say up front. I've thought about this a lot. I think in some ways Obama is a speech that has been cut mid-sentence, that if you followed the logic of what he thought, you would get to a very different place. And that's true of domestic policy. It's true of foreign policy. It's true of how he dealt with Iran, how he dealt with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think he saw what the endpoint could be, and he didn't think he could be the one who could bring it there. He once used this analogy. He said, you know, U.S. foreign policy is like a big ship. You could only move it by a few degrees, and then in the future, you'll see where it ends up. Of course, the future, he assumes Hillary Clinton would win, and then another Democrat. Turns out it was Donald Trump. So we never saw where that ship would have landed. But I think he was, in some ways, and maybe excessively so, persuaded of his own limitations as being the first Black president of the United States, whose legitimacy could quickly be called into question if he took steps that were viewed as too much outside of the foreign policy or domestic mainstream. So that way he was pretty careful. And on Israel-Palestine in particular, I think he was extremely aware, this was true during the campaign and it was true afterwards, that if he went further than he did, he feared, I think excessively so, that he'd be accused of being pro-terrorist, pro-Islamist, whatever it is, and he needed to prove otherwise. He made a comment once, and I can't remember if we mentioned it in the book, I don't think so, but he once in a small meeting said something to the effect of, you know, if Israel, if there's no consequences for the way Israel behaves, then why would they change? They're being perfectly rational, right? I mean, why would they not continue doing what they're doing if there's no consequence? And he said that at the same time wasn't prepared to impose the consequences. Again, I think intellectually, he could always see where his instincts led. Practically, politically, he ended halfway. And I think, again, another example that I've written about is his view about terrorism, right? I think he once got in trouble because he said more Americans die slipping in a bathtub than they do as a result of foreign terrorist acts. Did that prevent him from going on this? It was a war against terrorism. And I was coordinator of the fight against ISIS, but I think he was convinced by his own staff, if a terrorist attack occurs and you are known as having said something like that and not taken this sort of full battle gear, it's the end of the legitimacy of your presidency. And so I think he saw the logic. He thought, why are we getting involved yet again in another war in the Middle East? But the politics, the power of that gravitational pull of the politics and sort of the foreign policy establishment, Ben Rhodes has called the blob. I think that in the end led him to sort of not go as far as to carry his logic to its rational conclusion.
Doesn't that lead to an almost more damning indictment of him, that he knew better and he could have done better, but he chose not to for whatever reason? Lack of courage seems to have been part of it. This is one of the reasons I've generally been more critical of Obama than, say, Donald Trump, even though Donald Trump is objectively worse. Donald Trump, I don't really have much expectation. He doesn't promise something better than what he offers. There's no real dissonance. And there's something almost refreshingly transparent about Trump in foreign policy. He doesn't talk about human rights and supporting democracy abroad. He doesn't really
power.
He's just very brutal in his understanding of power, and that's what he delivers. Yeah. You get exactly what you knew you'd get. What hurts, what's so tragic and really hurts, and why so many of us, I think, feel a sense of betrayal when it comes to Obama, is because he promised great things. And when someone promises things that we've quite frankly never seen before, like someone who's as sympathetic to the Palestinians than other presidents, he gets things, as you mentioned. He understands that Israel won't change its behavior unless it understands that there will be consequences. Those are real fundamental realizations. And to have someone who realizes them but doesn't act on them, it hurts.
Yeah. So first of all, I do have that bias because of my respect for so much of what he represents. But as we say in the book, and we say this about Biden, Obama, we sort of group them. We say that after years of faux outrage, many Arabs preferred the real cynicism, the genuine cynicism of Donald Trump. I'm not saying that I prefer Donald Trump I do think that he could make life much worse for the Palestinians. Let's see. Maybe if he gets a ceasefire, then he would have done better. But his views are so detached from any sense of right, wrong, morality, justice, even more so than others, that I do fear that. But no doubt, I think for many, many people that I know in the region, they looked at Obama and Biden and said, what is this moralism that is completely detached from any of their actions? It's just rhetoric. I do think President Obama was a great speaker, and sometimes you could get enamored with your rhetoric and think that's a substitute for real action. And so you give a great speech in Cairo, and so you've kind of checked that box. So yeah, I do think we need, if only because of whoever the next Democratic president will be, need to reflect critically about on that presidency, and learning, as Damir said, about the raw exercise of power. And what is unique about Trump, and again, I'm not his fan, is that he's not captive to political interests, right? I mean, if he wants to put pressure on Israel, well, who's gonna object, right? You don't hear a peep. And he says things sometimes which really no predecessor that I know has said. He's not a prisoner to the foreign policy establishment because he doesn't even know what the foreign establishment believes or is, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it's just
incredible. It's absolutely incredible.
He could do a lot. I wish that he married those feelings with some sense of where he wanted to go, as opposed to ego and narcissism. But potentially, he really could do things that I think his predecessors were not willing, prepared, able to do.
Yeah, he's headed for, I think, this Friday is the Nobel Peace Prize.
I think he'll be disappointed. And then the question is, does he then say, "Oh, forget about Gaza"? I don't.
Right.
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 I'll be stunned beyond belief if they give him.
Of course.
But Rob, doesn't it say something about our blob, the foreign policy establishment, the people that we know and have spent a lot of time with, whether we like all of them or not? I mean, we're both of us are a product of that world, like educationally, intellectually, what have you. The fact that a lot of them seem to be moral people and do have some sense of right and wrong and are aware of what the word justice means, the fact that those people could preside over U.S. foreign policy for the last few decades in the Middle East and do such a disastrous job of it on any number of counts, but particularly on Israel-Palestine, present company excluded, of course. Can we draw like a deeper conclusion from that there is something fundamentally rotten about this foreign policy establishment, despite their pretense to morality?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, sort of when I said earlier that October 7th was Palestinian through and through, Israel's response was Israeli through and through, the Biden administration's response was American through and through. In all three cases, intensified, exacerbated by events, but the hypocrisy, the moralism, whenever, I'm sure you felt the same way, Shadi, but when I heard an American official, and I was not part of the administration then, thankfully, say, we're doing everything to get a ceasefire, even as they're continuing to provide the weapons that are making the fire ongoing. We truly believe that Israeli and Palestinian lives are of equal value when everything they do proves the opposite. Everything they were doing just highlighted the hypocrisies, the deceit, the lies of American foreign policy in a stronger way, I think, than predecessors were able, maybe because they didn't confront the situation. But yeah, there is something rotten, and it brings us back to what you were saying earlier. Is there a new generation now that is prepared because they've experienced this in their flesh and they see on their social media? How could they not sort of feel the way that you describe when they see America sort of saying one thing, doing something else, the moral hypocrisy, the inconsistency, the duplicity, which always existed. But again, I think October 7th put the microscope and it just looks, completely unfathomable and unspeakable. So yes, I think there's something really problematic about the foreign policy establishment. I've long believed it, even though I've been in and out of it. But we just the habits of that foreign policy are very hard to escape because there's a cost. Again, President Trump has escaped that cost, but most of his predecessors have felt if we're going to be accused of having, lost Saudi Arabia or lost Egypt or of having betrayed Israel or whatever it is, or being too weak on Iran. And those costs ultimately just seem too strong for most, for any president to say, I'm just going to overlook that and do what I think is either right or is going to work. Again, Trump may be the exception. And I think the lesson from that is if we could have a Democrat, if that's what we have, who has the same independence, political independence, foreign policy, sort of heterodoxy, but wedded to a vision that I feel more comfortable with than the narcissism of our current president, that could be the answer.
Well, I mean, we sort of had him. He just didn't win the nomination. Bernie Sanders.
And both you and I were involved in that campaign. I think it would have been a very interesting presidency. I don't know what would have happened. I really don't, because he would have faced so many headwinds. But it would have been interesting. I think we would be in a better place. But
okay. Well, on that note, that note of yearning and that sense of possibility.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Rob. Fascinating conversation. We covered a lot of ground. Congrats on the book again to our listeners and viewers. Tomorrow is yesterday. If you enjoyed this conversation, and even if you didn't, quite frankly, you should definitely buy a copy of the book and or read Rob's essay, which is an excerpt in the New Yorker, which will
They should buy the book.
But yeah, buy the book.
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah, of course.
No,
definitely.
but I mean, to be fair, I mean, I think it's a great taste because the book is so rich. Just to I mean, I do hate to push people on it. But it is, I think it's a really good snapshot and a taste of what's in store in the book, and really, really, really worthwhile.
And if you don't know much about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and you're too lazy to read more than one book, you can actually go a long way just with this one and then call it a day, really. You could just do that. Then you can act like you're smart at cocktail parties and do all that.
Which is why we read books at the end of the day, after all.
That's all that matters.
And so here is the actual rot in the foreign policy establishment right here in one sentence. Thanks, Rob. This is terrific.
Thanks.